When someone pulls away just as things start getting emotionally close, it can feel like a personal rejection. But what most people miss is that this behavior often has very little to do with the person they're pulling away from, and everything to do with how they've learned to protect themselves. Avoidant partners don't distance themselves because they don't care. They do it because somewhere along the way, closeness began to feel unsafe. Emotional intimacy, what most people crave in a relationship, can trigger discomfort for someone with an avoidant attachment style. And when that discomfort rises, the instinct isn't to lean in, it's to back away. Avoidance is not a random behavior. It's a coping mechanism that usually develops over time. For many people with avoidant tendencies, this starts in childhood. They might have grown up in environments where emotions were minimized, ignored, or even punished. Maybe showing vulnerability meant being shamed or told to toughen up. Maybe they learned that expressing neediness led to disappointment, not support. So they learned to rely on themselves. They learned that the safest way to avoid being hurt was to never get too close, to never rely too heavily on someone else, to always have one foot out the door, just in case. When you meet someone like this, they can be incredibly charming, independent, even charismatic. In fact, many avoidant people are very good at the beginning stages of dating. The early days are full of excitement, fun, and possibility. But they don't yet require deep emotional investment. There's a kind of safety in that space. But as soon as the relationship starts to feel real, when feelings deepen, when conversations become more vulnerable, when expectations naturally begin to grow, that's when the old alarm bells start to ring in their head. And instead of saying, "I'm scared," or "this is bringing up some uncomfortable feelings for me," they retreat. They go silent. They take space. They create emotional distance, not because they're trying to hurt you, but because this is what they know. This is how they protect themselves from what feels like emotional overwhelm. The problem is that this pulling away often sends the other person into a tailspin. It feels confusing. One minute things were going well, the next minute there's a wall. And unless you understand what's really going on, it's easy to internalize their behavior. You start asking yourself, what did I do wrong? Why did they change? How can I get them back? But that entire thought process assumes that their behavior is about you, when really it's about them trying to manage an internal discomfort they don't know how to explain. They may not even realize they're doing it. It can be completely unconscious. That's why it often happens in patterns. You'll see them engage and withdraw over and over again. Each time things start to feel too intimate, too connected, they instinctively retreat to a place that feels more in control. There's a kind of emotional thermostat they operate with. As soon as the temperature rises to a level they're not used to, when the relationship gets too warm, they pull the plug to cool things down. That might mean taking space, becoming emotionally distant, or focusing on small things that annoy them in the relationship, just to create separation. It's not about sabotage in the way we often imagine it. It's more about emotional regulation. It's how they manage the discomfort that closeness brings. This coping mechanism can be deeply frustrating if you're someone who thrives on connection and openness. You might feel like you're walking on eggshells, never knowing when they'll suddenly pull away again. You might feel tempted to chase, to explain, to overcompensate for the distance they've created. But at its core, avoidant behavior is a protective strategy. It's a shield built over years of learning that vulnerability equals risk. And when you realize that, it can help you depersonalize their reactions. Instead of seeing their withdrawal as a reflection of your worth, you begin to understand it as a reflection of their internal wiring. That doesn't mean their behavior is okay or that it should be excused, but it does mean it needs to be understood. Because once you see avoidance for what it really is, a learned survival strategy, you stop blaming yourself for it. You stop thinking you have to perform better, love harder, or prove yourself to get them to come closer. You begin to realize that the issue isn't about whether you're enough. It's about whether they're ready to let themselves feel safe enough to stay. Emotional closeness is what many people long for in a relationship. It's the moment where things begin to feel real, where walls come down, and where connection deepens. For most people, this is the phase where love truly starts to grow. But for someone with an avoidant attachment style, this very same closeness can set off a quiet internal alarm. The closer things get, the more exposed they feel. And instead of leaning into that vulnerability, they begin to pull away. Not because they don't like the person they're with, but because their sense of independence feels under threat. For an avoidant partner, independence isn't just a lifestyle preference, it's a form of emotional safety. Their autonomy is often the one thing they've always felt they could control. Many of them have spent years creating lives where they didn't have to depend on anyone, where emotional needs were handled internally, quietly, without involving others. This is often the result of early experiences where dependence or emotional openness was met with disappointment or neglect. Over time, these individuals learned that needing someone was risky and closeness was often followed by pain. So they made a quiet decision, perhaps even subconsciously, to stay self-sufficient at all costs. So when they start dating someone and things begin to progress naturally, more time spent together, more emotional vulnerability, more expectations, they start to feel a shift. They begin to sense that their time, space, and emotional energy are no longer solely theirs. They start to feel like their identity is being absorbed into the relationship. And this triggers a fear that they're losing the control they've worked so hard to maintain. It's not that they don't care about the person they're with. In fact, they might care a great deal. But care, in their mind, starts to conflict with freedom. They begin to feel that in order to maintain closeness, they must sacrifice something personal, whether it's space, autonomy, or a sense of self. And when someone feels that love comes at the cost of freedom, they start to retreat. This retreat might not always look dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, like becoming less responsive to messages, suddenly needing more me time, or focusing more on work or hobbies. Other times it can be more obvious, like canceling plans or expressing a need to slow things down. These moves aren't always planned. They often come from a reactive place. Something inside says, this is getting too close, and their instinct is to create distance in order to regain a feeling of balance. That balance for them often means maintaining a strong boundary between their inner world and the relationship. It's their way of saying, I need to protect my space before I disappear inside someone else. The irony is that many avoidant individuals do want love. They want connection, but they want it on terms that don't compromise their autonomy. The trouble is, true emotional intimacy requires a level of openness and vulnerability that can't coexist with rigid emotional boundaries. And when someone isn't comfortable with that kind of vulnerability, they'll often look for ways to regain control. That's when they start to reassert their independence, not just through action, but sometimes through emotional shutdowns. They may stop sharing how they feel. They might pull back physically. They might even start to focus on your flaws as a way of mentally creating distance. To someone on the receiving end, this shift can feel personal and painful. You might think, what did I do wrong? Or why are they suddenly different? But what's really happening is that your growing closeness has stirred a fear in them, one that says, if I let myself get too close, I'll lose who I am. It's a deeply rooted belief, and in many cases, they don't even recognize it for what it is. They just know that something doesn't feel right. So they follow the only script they know: create space, regain control, and re-establish the distance that feels familiar and safe. What makes this especially complicated is that to an avoidant person, needing space isn't about rejection, it's about survival. It's their way of trying to hold on to themselves in a situation that's starting to feel emotionally overwhelming. They don't necessarily want to end the relationship. They just want to feel like they still exist as an individual within it. And the only way they know how to do that is by stepping back, by pulling away, by making sure the closeness doesn't consume the identity they've worked so hard to protect. When a relationship starts to deepen and emotions begin to grow, it's natural for certain expectations to emerge. People begin to look for consistency, reassurance, shared responsibilities, and emotional availability. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, these very expectations can begin to feel like pressure. What was once light, playful, and spontaneous now feels heavier. The relationship no longer feels like an escape or an adventure. It starts to resemble a responsibility. And for avoidant partners, that shift can be deeply unsettling. They begin to equate emotional closeness with obligation, and suddenly what once felt exciting now starts to feel like something they need to escape from. This shift doesn't necessarily come from a place of dislike or resentment. In fact, it often stems from a deep-seated fear that love means giving up their freedom. They may not say it outright, but internally they begin to associate your needs and emotional expressions with demands. Every time you reach out for support, every time you ask for more time or affection, it gets interpreted through a filter of "I'm being required to give something up." This isn't because your needs are too much. It's because they were taught through their life experiences that emotional closeness comes with a price. That price, in their minds, is autonomy, independence, or personal peace. So instead of embracing the relationship as a source of mutual support, they begin to see it as a structure that threatens to limit them. This internal narrative often begins early in life. Many people with avoidant traits grew up in environments where relationships were conditional. Maybe they had to behave a certain way to earn love or meet expectations to gain approval. They might have seen one partner in a relationship become consumed or overwhelmed by the other's needs. So to them, love wasn't something that set you free. It was something that tethered you, something that came with a list of invisible obligations and emotional contracts. As a result, they learn to associate closeness with duty, not desire. And when that sense of duty begins to creep into their current relationship, they instinctively start to withdraw. This withdrawal doesn't always happen in loud, dramatic ways. Sometimes it shows up in the way they stop initiating plans, or how they pull back on compliments and affection. Sometimes they become more sarcastic or emotionally distant as a way of signaling that they're overwhelmed. And if you express hurt or confusion, they may feel even more pressure and retreat further, reinforcing the belief that relationships are emotionally draining. It becomes a cycle, one where your natural desire for connection and clarity makes them feel like they're being cornered, even if that's not your intention. They don't see your vulnerability as an invitation. They see it as another demand they don't know how to meet. What makes this dynamic even harder to navigate is that many avoidant partners don't fully understand what they're doing. They don't consciously think, "I'm going to back away now because I feel obligated." Instead, they feel an internal shift, a sense of suffocation or unease, and they respond the only way they know how. They take space. They become emotionally unavailable. They start to act in ways that put distance between you, hoping that space will relieve the pressure they feel building inside. What they don't realize is that the more they avoid, the more they unintentionally teach their partner that expressing emotion isn't safe, that asking for closeness results in silence or withdrawal. At the core of this is a misunderstanding of what love and connection actually mean. Avoidant partners often believe that to truly love someone, they have to constantly give something up. They fear being responsible for someone else's happiness because they already feel overwhelmed managing their own inner world. So they push back. They protect themselves by staying at an emotional distance, thinking it's the only way to remain in control. This protection mechanism becomes their default response whenever intimacy deepens, even if they genuinely want the relationship to work. They might even feel guilty about it, but the fear of losing themselves overrides the desire to stay close. In their world, love gets confused with being needed too much. Support gets mistaken for pressure. Commitment gets interpreted as a loss of self. And when those beliefs go unchallenged, they drive behavior that sabotages the very connection they crave. The relationship becomes a battleground between their desire for closeness and their fear of being consumed by it. They don't always recognize that love isn't meant to be a trap or a task list. It's meant to be a shared experience where both people feel seen, supported, and still whole as individuals. But until they untangle love from obligation in their mind, they'll continue to see connection as something they have to manage or escape from, rather than something they can truly enjoy. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, closeness doesn't feel like comfort. It feels like exposure. Emotional intimacy, which for many people is the goal of a relationship, can trigger deep discomfort in someone who has never truly felt safe being open. They might want connection on the surface, they might even crave it in moments, but when that connection starts to deepen, a subconscious alarm goes off. This alarm doesn't necessarily make logical sense. It's not about something the other person did wrong. It's about an old blueprint of belief that says, if I let someone in too far, I'm going to get hurt. Avoidant partners often grow up in environments where emotional vulnerability wasn't rewarded. In fact, it may have been punished, ignored, or simply met with silence. Maybe they learned that expressing feelings only made things worse. Or maybe they never saw healthy intimacy modeled in the first place. What they often did learn was that staying in control, staying private, and managing emotions on their own was the safest way to live. So even if they grow up and start longing for connection, their nervous system still equates closeness with danger. The very thing they're drawn to also feels like the thing they need to protect themselves from. This creates a confusing dynamic inside of them. On one hand, they might enjoy the time spent with their partner, the warmth, the chemistry, the laughter, but as things get more emotionally involved, when you start opening up more, when you become more expressive with your needs, when the relationship begins to feel emotionally real, that's when their internal defense systems start activating. They might begin to feel overwhelmed without fully understanding why. They might start pulling back, needing more time alone, withdrawing from deeper conversations. It's not because they don't like you or don't care. It's because they don't yet trust that intimacy can exist without leading to pain. This distrust isn't necessarily about you as a partner. It's about their history. When emotional intimacy has been associated with disappointment, loss, or betrayal in the past, it becomes wired into the brain as a risk. So instead of feeling safe in someone else's presence, they feel guarded. Every vulnerable moment becomes a quiet calculation. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I need too much? What if I rely on them and they disappear? These thoughts may not always be fully formed, but they exist beneath the surface, creating tension that builds the closer the relationship gets. And eventually, that tension drives them to pull away, not because they want distance, but because they don't know how to be close without feeling like they're putting themselves in harm's way. That's why emotional intimacy doesn't unfold naturally with someone who's avoidant. It often feels like a dance of approach and retreat. They come close when it feels safe, when the emotional stakes are low, when the moments are light-hearted. But when the relationship asks for more trust, more emotional availability, more openness, they instinctively step back. This isn't them being cold or unfeeling. It's them reverting to the protective behavior they've spent years depending on. To them, vulnerability isn't the beginning of love. It's a potential beginning of loss. And if they've never experienced intimacy without consequences, then pulling away feels like the safest option. This fear of intimacy can show up in subtle ways. They might downplay their feelings, avoid deep conversations, or make jokes in serious moments to deflect. They might resist labels or commitments because those things suggest an emotional closeness that they're not yet ready for. And if they do get close, it often happens in small, controlled doses. Just enough to maintain the connection, but not enough to feel fully exposed. It's a balancing act between wanting love and fearing what love demands emotionally. And when the fear outweighs the desire, they start to disengage. They might not understand why they're doing it. To them, it just feels like needing space or protecting their peace. But what's really happening is that their system is wired to expect pain where there is closeness. So even in a healthy, stable relationship, they're scanning for signs that something will go wrong. They're waiting for the moment when their openness will backfire, when their trust will be misplaced. This keeps them on guard, and that guard becomes a barrier to real intimacy. Even if they stay physically present, they can feel emotionally absent, and that absence creates distance that's hard to bridge. Until they begin to rewrite their internal story about what closeness really means, they will continue to protect themselves from the very thing they secretly wish they could fully experience. When avoidant partners begin to feel emotionally close to someone, it's not just the intimacy that triggers discomfort, it's also the fear of emotional dependence. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, relying on another person feels like dangerous territory. The idea of depending on someone else emotionally touches a nerve that's rooted deep in their experience. They might want to be cared for, supported, and understood, But the moment they feel themselves leaning too much, an internal resistance kicks in. That resistance doesn't show up as a conscious thought. It shows up as a quiet but powerful urge to pull back, to protect, to re-establish a sense of emotional control. Dependence is a word that avoidant individuals often associate with weakness or vulnerability. They may have learned early on that people can't be counted on, that when they needed someone the most, help didn't come. Or worse, it came with conditions. So they built a belief system that says, I can only rely on myself. This belief isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. It lives in the body. It informs how they respond in moments of closeness, especially when they start to feel like they're becoming emotionally invested. That investment feels risky because the more they care, the more potential there is to be hurt or let down. So to avoid that possibility, they keep people at arm's length, especially when emotions run deep. They may genuinely enjoy spending time with someone. They might even fall in love. But when the relationship begins to require emotional give and take, when it becomes clear that you expect them to show up not just physically, but emotionally, that's when their old defense mechanisms rise to the surface. They might pull away after an especially vulnerable conversation. They might go quiet after a weekend of deep connection. Not because anything is wrong on the surface, but because internally they're dealing with a kind of emotional hangover. They've let someone in further than they're used to, and now their system is trying to rebalance by retreating. It's like their emotional boundaries are under repair. They need to shut down in order to feel stable again. What makes this pattern so confusing for their partner is that it often feels inconsistent. One moment things are warm and connected, the next moment there's distance. It's hard not to take that personally. But this push-pull dynamic is often not about how they feel about you. It's about how they feel about feeling dependent. They've spent so much of their lives cultivating emotional independence that anything that threatens it, even something as simple as needing reassurance or comfort, can feel like too much. They don't want to need you, not because you're not trustworthy, but because needing anyone feels like stepping into the unknown. When you start becoming a meaningful emotional presence in their life, it forces them to face something they've long avoided, the fact that they actually do want and need connection. That realization can be terrifying because it disrupts the narrative they've lived by. It challenges the identity they've built as someone who doesn't need anyone to be okay. And rather than admit that to themselves, it's easier to create distance. It's safer to retreat into solitude, to refocus on work, hobbies, or other distractions that help them reassert control. That control becomes their safety net, the thing they return to when emotional vulnerability becomes overwhelming. But what they don't always see is how this pattern erodes trust. Every time they pull away, it sends a message that emotional intimacy isn't safe. It tells their partner that closeness leads to withdrawal, that vulnerability is met with silence. This can create a dynamic where the other person starts walking on eggshells, afraid to express their needs in case it causes the avoidant partner to shut down again. Over time, this damages the very connection both people want but are struggling to maintain. One person is afraid of needing too much, the other is afraid of being too much, and neither feels fully seen or safe. Avoidant partners often believe they're protecting themselves by maintaining emotional distance, but in reality, they're reinforcing the very loneliness they wish they could escape. They long for connection, but the fear of emotional dependence makes them sabotage it. They want to be close, but they also want to feel in control. And those two desires often clash. So they oscillate between connection and distance, between longing and fear, without realizing how much it confuses and hurts the people who care about them. They may not even have the language to express what they're feeling, because they've spent so long trying not to feel at all. But until they begin to recognize that dependence isn't the same as weakness, that needing someone can be part of a healthy, balanced relationship, they will continue to mistake emotional safety for emotional threat.